So, good morning, Adele. So, this is your history lesson on Chapter 3, The American War for Independence. So, this chapter is very important for us to know because if we didn't have the War for Independence, we'd still be under the rule of the King of England at that time, who had taken away a lot of the Americans' freedoms, and we would have still had a lot of our freedoms taken away from us here. So you'll see how important this is as we go through history. We're looking clear back to 1775. So just think, that's a long time ago, a few hundred years ago, right? But we're still standing on those freedoms. So let's talk about the War of Independence at this time. So we went over the American War for Independence in 1775 with the shot heard around the world. Why was the shot heard around the world? Because it began the Revolutionary War. And it was at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. And the news of fighting at Lexington Concord spread northward, where a group of brave patriots in the Green Mountains of what is now Vermont prepared to fight the British. They had no fine uniforms to compare with the British redcoats. Remember, their uniforms were bright red, but their love of freedom gave them courage that they needed to stand up to their enemies. So here's Vermont. If you look in your map, they're clear up there at the north part. You see where Vermont is, and you see those areas where battles were clear up there. So let's find out what kind of battle this was. So the British, we'll say, it says Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. Who were the Green Mountain Boys? Let's find out. The British held Fort Ticonderoga, and that Ticonderoga, you can see where that is. It's a fort up there. It was located beside Lake Champlain near the main road between Canada and New York. So the British held this fort up there, and the reason they held this fort is that they could keep control of the Americans at that time. And so, Ethan Allen and his boys knew, we need to go into Fort Ticonderoga and overtake it, right? So the control of this fort was important to the British because of its location and its supplies. Inside the fort were guns, cannons, and ammunition that the colonists badly needed. Ethan Allen and a group of patriots from Vermont who called themselves the Green Mountain Boys were determined to take Fort Ticonderoga from the British. So the British, at this fort, there was a lot of British there, and they held this fort, and it was right at the border of Canada where the British would come in to America. And so, this brave as they were, this little group of guys, got together as the Green Mountain Boys to attack this huge British fort. You can see a picture of it there. In the early morning hours, while the British slept, the Green Mountain Boys surrounded Fort Ticonderoga. And Ethan Allen came in at night, and then he came up and he went all the way and knock on the commander's door. Can you believe that? And ordered the surrender. He said, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress," he said. And this shocked the commander. It shocked the commander. The British commander woke up, and then he knew he had no choice but surrender. So, was that a big battle? No. The British just surrendered at Fort Ticonderoga, in the middle of the night. And especially they were afraid, in the Ethan Allen saying, "In the name of the great Jehovah," which he was saying, great Jehovah Jesus, right? In the name of Jesus. And the Continental Congress, too, which they thought, who is the Continental Congress? But it represented America. He said, "You need to surrender." And he said, "Okay, we'll surrender." Without a fight. That was pretty brave, don't you think? Let's go on to the next section. It even gets more courageous as Americans come together, in the midst of the fighting of their freedom for their freedom. So the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill. Where's Bunker Hill? Well, you need to look at your map there and you see Bunker Hill is in Massachusetts, clear up there in the north there. You see those battles of Bunker Hill. Well, the British soldiers who were camped in Boston thought they were invincible. The British soldiers had taken over Boston. They were camped there. They would come right into the homes of the families, and just say, we're taking over. They didn't care, and they were just they'd come in and say, you guys feed us. You do that. That's what the British soldiers were doing to the people in Boston. And the Bostonians, the people there, the Americans couldn't come in and out, and they couldn't, get supplies. They were being surrounded by the British, not able to do anything. And so it was a sad time for Boston. And so, of course, Boston now is going to stand up, for their rights as Americans. So the British soldiers who were camped in Boston, they thought they were invincible. Like, what can these Americans do? They thought the Continental Army did not have the power to chase away the army at all. They thought, what kind of army could Boston have, Americans? And on June 17th, 1775, several thousand American colonial soldiers climbed up Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, that's right over Boston there in Massachusetts, that overlooked the city of Boston. They dug trenches and holes and ditches to protect themselves. When morning came, they surprised the British troops with the attack. The citizens of Boston even watched the battle, like, here they come, the Americans come, they're going to save us, because they were being kept captive and by the British army, the people of Boston were. And when the morning came, and when they surprised the British troops, the citizens of Boston watched the battle from the rooftops. Can you imagine going to your rooftops and watching the war going on right in your hometown? That's what happened. The colonists kept beating the British back as they tried to attack. But when they ran out of gunpowder, the colonists were forced to retreat. So they had to retreat. And so England still had control of Boston. But even though the Continental Army, that's the American Army, did not win the Battle of Bunker Hill, they showed the British that they could fight with determination and bravery. And less than a year later, with the help of cannons taken from Fort Ticonderoga, the colonists forced the British troops out of Boston and took back their city. Bravery. The Americans stood and they said, we're going to protect America. We're going to protect the people of Boston. They got together, organized the army, and they fought until they had no more gunpowder left. But they fought so valiantly that put fear into the British army, thinking, wow, the Americans are going to fight against us, in the midst of all this, because they almost won. But at that point later on, they would win. Quite valiant, quite courageous. The next talks about the olive branch petition. What's an olive branch? Well, the olive branch is in the Bible meaning peace. The olive branch was to come to another country or another people and say, petition, let's have peace. We don't want war. So let's think about what were Americans in the Continental Congress. They didn't really want war. So they thought they'd reach out to England with peace and say, this is why we're fighting. This is what we want to petition. We don't want a war. But we'll see what happens. So most colonists in America hoped to avoid war with Britain, but they were willing to fight for their independence if they were not going to be treated fairly. In July of 1775, the Second Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress got together and wrote a petition to King George III, who was the king at that time. Since an olive branch has been the symbol of peace throughout history, Congress called the document the Olive Branch Petition. The petition contained a list of changes that would have to happen for a peaceful agreement to be made between England and her colonies. If King George III agreed, the American colonists would continue to be loyal to him. If not, they will continue to fight for their independence. Well, what did King George do? King George III refused to listen to the colonists. He was determined to rule them. He demanded their obedience. He didn't answer the petition in a good way. So with this decision, the king forced the colonists to continue their fight. Americans did not want to fight, but now they knew the king had actually declared war on America. Before Continental Congress could declare war on England, England already declared war on America. In England, many people thought it was time for King George III to give the colonists the freedoms they were demanding. A lot of the British people thought, you should give them. We've been treating them unfairly. One of those people was John Wesley. John Wesley was a loyal British evangelist. He was a pastor. He was a preacher. And Wesley believed that England should not fight against the colonists, and he wrote Lord North, an English leader, about the colonists because he had been there. He said, "These men will not be frightened, and it seems they will not be conquered as easily as was first imagined. They will probably dispute every inch of ground, and if they die, they'll die with a sword in their hand. They are as strong men as you, and they are as valiant as you, if not abundantly more valiant, for they are one and all enthusiasts, and they're enthusiasts for liberty, for freedom." So important decisions were to be made at this time. You can imagine. Think of yourself at that time. If you were living in Boston, Massachusetts, or if you were living up in Vermont, or if you were living in Georgia or any of the colonists, Virginia, you can imagine the way you'd feel as the colonists were looking to unite in unity for their freedom. So the important decisions had to be made. The Second Continental Congress continued to meet in Philadelphia during the year of 1776. So that's very important, 1776. This was the Second Continental Congress, the second time the Congress got together, the most important time too. The colonists received word that since there were not enough English soldiers to continue fighting, King George III, he hired German soldiers called Hessians to help fight against the American colonists. What? He hired people? He hired Germans that weren't even English? Yeah. Those Germans came over and they didn't care about England and they didn't care about America. They were just wanting some extra money. So you pay me and I'll fight for wherever side that you want. Let me tell you something about those Hessians. A lot of them came to America and they became Americans and just deserted the British army altogether, realizing they didn't want to fight against Americans. So Hessians were fighting. They were fighting. They were mercenaries. They were fighting just for money that the king would pay them. So when the colonists found out about the Hessians, most of the loyalty that the colonists had for the king were destroyed. They thought, did you know the king are hiring, killers to come over and just kill us? That he's paying people to do this? So that, of course, Americans are thinking the king does not care about us at all. So when the colonists found out, they decided, we are not going to be loyal to this king. We are not going to be loyal to Great Britain, which was England. The Patriots now outnumbered Loyalists. The Loyalists were those that were loyal to the king, and the Patriots now know they were going to stand up for America. Many colonists realized they must fight to be independent country, free from England's rule now. There's no other choice. The representatives of the Second Continental Congress decided that it was time to declare freedom. from England. It's time they had to do it. They tried the olive branch. They tried for peace. They went to Europe to the king, and the king did not. He ignored them totally, and also sent hired soldiers. A lot of the British Army didn't really want to go fight in America because they knew a lot of their friends and family were Americans. So, the king had to hire killers to come. And let's say some of those Germans, they ended up not wanting to go back to even Germany, and a lot of them became American citizens. It's kind of crazy, but that's what happened. So let's look at your questions, and you write these down, what you think, and they're very easy now, so just put what we just read into your brain, but not only that, into your heart. So write the correct answer in the blank. So it says, number 1, why was control of Fort Ticonderoga important to the British Army? Do you remember Fort Ticonderoga up there by the Canadian and the Green Mountain Boys? It was so because it had all these British supplies. And when they took over the fort, they took over these British supplies. They had guns and cannons and ammunition. And its location was right there on the border of Canada, where through Canada, there was a lot of, Canada was actually controlled by England. So there was a lot of Canadian English forces that would come down and fight against America. So taking that fort was very important. So here's what to write. Because of its location and because of its supplies. Okay. At the end, I'll show you a picture of what I wrote, so you can figure out what to write down. So how did Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys take Fort Ticonderoga? Did they have a big battle? They took them while they were sleeping. Ethan Allen went up the door and knocked on the door and said, "The name of Jehovah and the Second Continental Congress surrender." And they said, "Okay." That was it. There was no real battle, but they took over the fort without a battle. They knocked on the door and shocked them at night. So what did the British learn about the colonists at the Battle of Bunker Hill? What did the British learn? The Battle of Bunker Hill was fought very valiantly. The British didn't think that Americans could fight at all. They thought, what are these people, They think they can get together and fight the British Army, we fought all over the world and we're controlling most of the world right now. They did not think, they thought very little. But what did they learn at Bunker Hill? That the Americans could fight with determination and bravery. They learned that the Americans were very brave. So they thought, wow, these Americans are not what we thought. So what was the Olive Branch Petition? Number 4, what was the Olive Branch Petition? It was a list that the Americans sent to King George, the freedoms that they need. And it was a list that they would have to change to have a peaceful agreement. How did King George III respond to the Olive Branch Petition? Number 5, how did he respond? He refused to listen to him at all. He actually sent a hired German Hessians to come in and fight for England, to fight against the colonists. So you can say, what did happen? He refused to listen. Who were the Hessians? They were those German soldiers that the king hired. Hessian soldiers. They were just wanted the money. They didn't care about English and they didn't care about American, but they just said, give us the money and we'll fight. He hired Hessian German soldiers. So, hey, that's part of American history. So we're going to go on in our next video. And this is getting exciting, isn't it?